in our text this morning, which is from 1 Corinthians chapter 10, Paul is addressing, or has been addressing, questions that the Corinthian church had sent to him. About how to deal with some of the problems that they were having in the church. One of the problems they were having was arguments over whose preaching they liked the best. Another question that he responded to was about Christian morality, sexuality, entertainment, marriage and divorce. He responded to questions of being sensitive to the conscience of other believers. That what you and I do, because we think we have the freedom to do that, we can cause another believer to stumble in their walk with God, because we have not considered how the impact of our actions might affect them. When we come to chapter 10, Paul raises the question of temptation. And he uses a verse that I'm sure that you've heard quoted and perhaps have quoted yourself many, many times. If you're in the 10th chapter of 1 Corinthians, scan down to verse 13. And let's read it together. No temptation has overtaken you except what is common to us all. And God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you are tempted, He will also provide a way out so that you can endure it. No temptation has overtaken us. What a great promise. What a great promise. And we're going to look at that a little more carefully before we finish up this morning. But what does Paul mean when he refers to temptation? What is it that he is talking about and relating to us? And why does he bring it up here? And even more, what does it mean to you and me? What does this little statement that he has made mean to you and me? We begin to understand when we take a look at the opening verses of this chapter. And he begins talking from Israel's history. Read the first 4 verses with me, would you? Let's read them out loud. For I do not want you to be ignorant of the fact, brothers and sisters. You're not reading with me. Let's read out loud together. Verse 1 of chapter 10. Okay. Corinthians. Yes. 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Beginning again, verse 1. For I do not want you to be ignorant of the fact, brothers and sisters, that our ancestors were all under the cloud, and that they all passed through the sea. They were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. They all ate the same spiritual food and drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that accompanied them, and that rock was Christ. About whom is Paul speaking here? The people of Israel. Absolutely. Talking about the nation of Israel. And he's going back to all of their history. Okay? What does he mean when he talks about the cloud? Okay? Every day there was a cloud of God's presence that led them. And at night, he doesn't mention it, but at night there was also a pillar of fire that was indicative of God's presence with them. What does it mean when he talks about the sea? It says they were baptized into the cloud and into the sea. What's he talking about? Passing through the Red Sea. Okay? So he's going back and he's talking about these historical events that have taken place in the land of Israel. They were, what does it mean when it says they were baptized into Moses? That they experienced what it meant to be under Moses' leadership and to experience the things that God did through Moses. Okay? And so they came under Moses' leadership. It says they ate the same spiritual food. What's that? Manna. Or quail. That's right. Because God miraculously provided quail one time as well. Now that brought other problems, but nonetheless, it was still a miraculously provided meal. And they drank the same spiritual drink. What's that? Water that came from the rock. They were at a place where there was no water. And however many hundreds or tens of thousands of them there were at the time, they needed water. They were out of water, and God miraculously provided water for them. These folks had seen and participated in some of the most remarkable events ever recorded in human history. Think about that. The parting of the Red Sea, the cloud that occupied their space and that was the presence of God, the spiritual food, the spiritual drink. I mean, they had some of the most amazing things occur in their lives of anyone ever in any place in any period of history. And they were unique in that. But there was something else they participated in. And we pick that up in verse 5. He says, nevertheless, God was not pleased with most of them. I'm sorry, but we have to stop here for a second. Why would God not be pleased with them after them having experienced all of these incredible manifestations of God's power? Say again, Joanne. They complain. Okay? What'd you say, Brian? Okay? And every time. You know, I love it. They really pick up on this in the Old Testament when they recount the experience with them coming to the edge of the Red Sea and the Egyptian army is bearing down on them, and the Hebrews turn to Moses and they say, so there weren't enough graves in Egypt that you had to bring us out here today. I mean, you look at it, it's in the text. I mean, it's just this very Jewish turn. You know, it's oive. I mean, what is going on here? What are you doing? And he said, Paul says that God was not pleased with most of them. You know how many most of them is? All but two. All but two. Because the period of wandering that they had to do for 40 years was so that the first generation of Israelites that had come out of Egypt would die. Because they had continued to walk in disobedience to God. And that is why God was not pleased with them. That is why He brought them to their end in the desert before they ever were able to make it into the land of Canaan. At each event, there was a contingent of people who wanted to go back to Egypt, to the slavery that they had in Egypt, and not continue to pursue the promise that God had promised them. They come, I just mentioned, they come to the Red Sea and they turn to Moses and say, there weren't enough graves. Then they don't have water, and they turn to Moses and they're, you brought us out here to die. We should go back. They find that they don't have food to eat. And at every point, they not only complain, but they were ready to turn their backs on God and ready to go back to their old way of living because they found themselves in a difficult spot. And it happened over and over and over and over again. And frankly, I find it remarkable. Wouldn't you think that at some point they would begin to think to themselves, maybe God really does have this thing under control. When they keep getting everything they need, and it lets us know that the issue that was really at work here wasn't about whether or not they were going to have their needs met. The issue was who's going to be God in their lives. Who was going to be the one who directed their path. And because of their inclination to not trust God, they all died in the wilderness and didn't receive the promise. And look at verse 4. Or excuse me, not verse 4. Verse 6. Now these things occurred as examples. I don't know about you, but I usually think of an example as something I want to follow. Right? Somebody's a good example. It's somebody that his or her behavior is such that I want to follow that behavior and I want to be like them. And yet Paul very clearly says that what we see happening with the people of Israel is God giving us examples so that we can learn from the lessons that they have had. God uses the Israelites as an example for a specific reason. And he tells us in verse 6, now these things occurred as examples to keep us from setting our hearts on evil things as they did. Do not be idolaters as some of them are, as it is written. The people sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in revelry. And he talks about us not being caught by the same lusts and passions. Too many times we think of lust and passion as a sexual thing, and it's far more than that. It's anything that we become captured by, anything that gets hold of us, and that could be boat racing, that could be skiing, it could be any number of things that so become a controlling influence in our lives that we are going to give more attention to it than we even would God himself. Paul brings an interesting word into the discussion here, and he uses the word idols. Idols are the things that we worship instead of God. Idols are the things that you and I have in our lives that have a higher place of importance on our value system than God himself. Now, you may be sitting there thinking, well, Pastor, that's ridiculous. Really? Why don't you take a look? Why don't you ask yourself some hard questions? And what are the things that are in our lives that we might put in a higher place than God himself? Have you ever been around someone who was involved in practicing that? That their attention given to something other than God elevated that thing to a higher place in their lives than God. There are some people who do that with their work. There are some people who do that even with family. There are some people who do that with position. And they lift that to such a high place that it becomes an idol in their lives. We all understand the importance of food, of safety, of water, and of drink. No one would fault the Israelites for coming to a place where they had no food and they wondered, okay, God, what are you going to do now? And no one would question their being concerned about having water. But what do you think would happen or would begin to happen in our thinking when we stand at the edge of the Red Sea and God miraculously parts the Red Sea? And we come to a place now where we have no water. Do you think maybe we might think back and say, well, look what God did the last time. And then when we come to a place where we have no food, we think, well, God not only parted the Red Sea, but He also provided water for us. What do you think God might do now with our food need? Do you think that God just might do something miraculous here? Yes. See, that's why Paul is saying these folks are examples to us, because he wants us to look at their lives and he wants us to see that they missed those connections. They missed those connections. Now, would you just, in a moment of honesty and personal reflection, how many times have we, all of us, have we stood at a place of real need in our lives? And it's almost as if God was not a factor in the discussion. Have you ever been there? And we're thinking about everything else. We're thinking about everything else that we can do. We're thinking about all the other stuff that we can do to solve this problem. And God really isn't a factor in the discussion. And we lay awake at night and we worry, and we worry, and we worry, and we fret. And we even get to the point where we will do things that compromise our integrity. Where we do things that when we look at them after we do them, we say to ourselves, I can't believe I did that. I know none of you have ever had that problem. But the person who cheats by putting her age on a job application and makes her age a little bit lower because she's afraid that she won't get hired if they know her true age. Because she really needs a job. Well, wait a minute. Who's running this thing? Who is the one that's God? If He parted the Red Sea, if He brought water out of the rock, if He caused manna to fall from heaven, is it possible that He can do those things in your life and mine? And that's Paul's whole point. It's that, yes, it is. And these folks are examples to us of what happens when we allow something else to get our attention. And the thing that's needed is more important to us than the God who can provide the thing that's needed. Does that make sense to you? The thing that's needed becomes more important than the God who can provide the thing that's needed. Paul describes these folks as examples another time. It's in verse 11. He says, these things happened to them as examples and were written down as warnings for us, on whom the culmination of the ages has come. That's an amazing statement that Paul makes. He said the lives of the Hebrews and their responses to the temptations that they faced. Because here's the temptation. When you stand at the Red Sea or the rock or wherever it is that you stand, the temptation is, will I trust God to help me through this, or will I use my own resources? So that becomes the challenge. Where will we come down on that issue? And almost every time, the people of Israel chose not to trust God, but to rely on their own ability to provide whatever it was that they needed. And so these were written down to teach us, so that we can learn from firsthand experience, so that they would be examples to you and I of what our response can be. Because you see, these stories that we've read could have had a different answer. They could have had a different conclusion. What could it have been? And trust God. And they learned that when they found themselves in a difficult place, that God was fully reliable and that He would help them through, and that we can rest in the confidence that God will do just that. So they could have been examples to us in either circumstance. It all depends on how we respond and what we choose to do in terms of our response to the temptations that we make or that we experience. Paul's comment that these stories were written for those of us on whom the end of the ages has come. I thought that was so interesting, because here's God thinking about us all the way back in the time of Israel wandering through the wilderness. He's thinking about what our struggles are going to be. He's thinking about the difficulties that we are going to face when we start walking through the experiences of our life and trusting Him. And so He had these things written down so that when our time came, we could look back at what their experience was. And we could learn not to respond the way they have, but to respond to a God who said that He was fully trustworthy. I have a sad bit of news for you this morning. Temptations will continue to come.
What?
Sorry to bring that news to you, Clyde. Doubting the promises of God is part of the human predicament. It's part of where you and I live. Because it always takes faith for us to step over. We talked earlier, why was God displeased with them? Because they didn't learn to walk in faith. They didn't learn to trust Him. And the lesson that you and I are learning when we face the temptations of our lives is, whom will we trust? Will we trust God? Or will we trust this person? Or will we trust another person? Or will we trust an institution? Or will we trust God? And what God is giving us here in the lives of the people of Israel is He is giving us an example in each of them as to how we can learn to live lives of trust. But here's some more good news. But we are not doomed to continue to act like the people of Israel did. The fact that temptations will come and the fact that we may have difficult times that come before us, that's true. But we are not doomed to commit the same failures. And that's why the examples have been given to us. And so we finish this morning by talking about escaping temptation, because that's what this verse says. How many times have you ever heard someone quote 1 Corinthians 10:13 and say, there is no temptation that has come to you except what is common to man, and God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear, but when you are tempted, He will provide a way of escape. Ever heard anybody quote it that way?
Yeah.
What's wrong with that? A way of escape so you will be able to bear it. So God's intention is not to jettison us out of the temptations that we have. What God's intent is to show you and I we can win the battle. We can win the battle because He has won the battle. You know what's really interesting, and it's just a side note, and I'm not going to take any time with it, but did you notice as we were reading the rock that they struck the water? What did they say that rock was?
Jesus.
Christ. Okay? All the way back to Moses' day, there was an awareness of this Messiah that was to come. Okay? That was going to be our deliverer and was going to give you and I a way to overcome the temptations that come at us and would overwhelm us. I just want to walk through this last verse 13 with you just a second, and look at some of the component parts to it. First of all, the temptations are common. Everyone has them, everyone goes through them. There's the issue of job loss, the issue of sickness, there's the issue of relationship conflicts, bullying at school, or other places for that matter. There's all these temptations that are common to us. Does that idea that somehow those are common give you any comfort? It doesn't? It doesn't? Okay. Well, you have a right to your opinion. It's nice for me to know I'm not weird. It's nice for me to know that I'm not the only one who has those issues. Okay, but they are common to all of us. Now, it doesn't make them any easier to handle, and maybe that's where you're coming from. It doesn't make them any easier, but the fact is that they're common. They're common to us. And yet, how many of us, when we find ourselves in a temptation, we go, "Oh, I can't believe what's going on in my life." Right? And what Paul is saying to us here is, let's just kind of chill out a little bit, and let's recognize what's going on, and know that God already has something in store. I think one of the most powerful verses I ever came across was I was reading John chapter 6 one time, and it was when Jesus is feeding the multitude with the 5 loaves and 2 fish. And John is the only one that records this, but it says that Jesus turned to John and said, "Give them something to eat." Okay? Now they've got 5,000 men there, not including the women and children. And Jesus turns to John and says, "Give them something to eat." And the powerful verse was this. That's what Jesus said to him because he already knew what he was going to do. I want to tell you something. God already knows what he's going to do in your life. He already knows what he is going to do in your circumstance to turn that temptation into a place of great celebration of the victory of God. But we have to be willing to stand at the base of the Red Sea until he parts it. We have to be willing until the rock breaks open with water coming from inside it that you could have never seen before. We have to be willing to do that. And the temptation is, how will you and I respond? And what will we do? So the temptations are common, but God is faithful. God is faithful. He is not going to leave you hung out to dry by yourself with no other resources and put you in a place where you will be overcome by this thing. God is faithful to be with us and to walk with us. How I wish that we can all grasp this small little truth. God is faithful. God is faithful. And he's faithful to you. He's faithful to you in your circumstances. He's waiting for us to reach out and respond to him. That's what God's looking for. Because it's in our doing that he's going to come into our situation. God's faithful in 2 ways. He will not allow you to be tempted above what you are able to bear. That will not happen. Now, I know that all of us tend to think that the temptation that we're facing right now is more than we can overcome. And yet, the promise that God gives us in His Word is He will not put on us more than what we can bear. That He will see to it that it fits us. It's interesting, for all that Job went through, Satan first had to get God's permission to do whatever he was going to do to Job. And God gave him very clear, specific guidelines as to what he could do. And I don't think that's unreasonable for us to look at and think that God does the same thing in our lives. That He doesn't put us in places that are more difficult than what we can bear. We think it is, but that's because we are learning to trust God in that situation. The second way God is faithful is that He will provide a way of escape. But the way of escape is so that we can bear the temptation. It's not to jettison us out into comfort and ease, but it's to make it possible that you and I can walk through the difficulty, the temptation that we're facing. We can walk through that, and we can see that God helped us get through it, and we were able, in God's strength, to be stronger than the thing that we were being tempted with. And that, folks, is the end game. And that is how we become spiritually mature. That is how we become strong in the Lord and in the power of His might. So that we are then able to move into the next temptation with the sense of, I know that I can count on God. Now, we all know this, don't we? That the next temptation that you encounter is going to be a little bit different from this one. It always is. Because if you could then begin to stereotype the temptations, then there wouldn't be as much to learn and as much to grow from. Okay? God is faithful. Won't put on you more than you can bear. And He will not. He will make a way of an escape for you. Let me ask you, what are the temptations that you're up against right now? What are the things in your life that are causing you difficulty and stress? Maybe even causing you to think that maybe you should start looking for another way to guide your life. That maybe Christianity isn't quite what you thought it was. I simply want to tell you this morning. But that's exactly what temptations are designed to do, is to make you think that, so that you will give up and walk away. And what God wants to do is He wants to show you how He is able to help you overcome as you learn to trust Him. So, the temptations are real. They hurt. They create fear. They make us afraid. We have some big things to lose. Maybe big financial investments. Maybe you've got a house. Maybe you've got something else that you're trying to navigate through. And there's some real fear about what would happen if it's not done just the right way. There's no temptation that has come to you except as what's common. And God is faithful, and He will provide a way of escape so that you can bear it. Would you pray with me?